This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about sentences. We're going deep dive, nitty-gritty here, sentence level stuff. And as authors, for our purposes here, we are not interested in grammar and punctuation. There are plenty of style manuals out there. I forgot to bring one in front of the camera, so I will reference it later to put in the show notes. I'll just send Kathryn the title. We are interested in what makes a sentence work in a story. And so I went through some books. I managed to find 7 sentences to present and had, I found that a book might be wonderful, but still not have great, beautiful sentences in it. So what did you guys find?
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, we were just briefly talking off air about going searching for stories that we love, and then you think, oh yeah, this one's just beautifully written, and you open it up and think, yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, no, that's not good enough to. That's not good enough to discuss. No, there's nothing unusual about that one. Right. Why is that? So then, as I started to do a bit more looking around, I think I get some of it is not necessarily exactly at sentence level. It's a bit preceding and post. So there's a little bit of, what's in the paragraph and the context. Obviously,
right.
that then the delivery is just so. So for me, it started to become more about how did that sort of level of sentence construction lend itself to the overall prose and the craft.
Right.
But yeah, it is interesting once you start drilling down. You think, well, no, I can write a sentence like that.
Right.
Right. I think that was my problem. Is I literally can't. We'll go with can't, present tense. Pick a sentence because I just feel like I don't even know what I'm looking for. I don't know what I'm looking for. Like, am I looking for specific words, not being there, description being there, and not being there? Am I looking, I just didn't even know what I was looking for. So I pulled a bunch of books that, like Robert said, I really enjoyed. And that stuck with me for their prose beauty, right? And I couldn't find a single sentence that represented that to me. So there you go.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I had a similar experience with one book that I really enjoyed reading, and I teach an excerpt of it quite frequently. And I thought, oh, there's going to be something powerful and dynamic in here. And I started flipping through and looking at sentences and going, no. Like it's all, they're fine. They're good, but they aren't right. Great, beautiful, remarkable sentences.
I think this is telling though, really, don't you?
It is, yeah.
What we've been saying all along, that compelling storytelling trumps prose every time, and so you could concentrate on writing the most beautiful sentences in the world and win literary prizes for just the one sentence, but it isn't necessarily a story that's going to linger in somebody's mind.
Right. Yeah, it was more about whether or not the sentence functioned among the whole, right? Rather than when you remove that sentence, oh, it's gorgeous. That doesn't really happen very often.
Right. Well, and I think our goal was not to find beautiful sentences exclusively or explicitly, but to go in and find what makes a sentence really work. And I did, in looking for sentences, I did find sort of some different categories we could put sentences in that make them work. So one is functional. It's just doing its job beautifully, conveying precisely what it needs to the reader. And maybe at the other end of that spectrum, we can put beautiful, where the prose is just luxurious and you want to reread the sentence because it's so beautifully written. And perhaps those are main categories, and then we could call the other things subcategories. Some sentences are metaphorical. They're giving us that sense of what something is or is like, a metaphor or a simile, you know, giving us that kind of comparison or that layer of understanding. Other sentences are delivering imagery, right? So now we're getting a sensory experience, and other sentences are punchy. So they're delivering something. It might be the end hook. It might be the reveal in the middle of a scene. It might be that bit of dialogue that just twists that relationship. So it's got some strong dramatic.
Yeah.
And there might be some other subcategories we can come up with as well while we look at sentences and talk about them.
Because in another program that I'm a member of, and I've spoken about this before, where we're analysing stories but using movies to do that because it's efficient. There's been a fair bit of discussion about, well, you know, a turning point or a reveal or something in a movie can actually be just an actor's expression. You know, if the director and the acting is sufficiently finessed, then that can happen. And we don't have that available to us in books, but to me, that's where prose, the tapestry of prose starts to come in, where, and I don't mean directly transcribing, you know, her left eyebrow slightly twitched in, you know, I don't mean that you literally translate the actor's expression, but to me, that's where the functionality of sort of at paragraph and sentence level, it comes in, where we know we've got to deliver something that's going to keep the narrative drive going, that's going to, you know, impact the reader in a way. And I think that's what I feel like I do in probably, you know, third or fourth drafts, is start to get down to that level. So, but yeah, the idea, like Monty Python's Deadliest Joke, you know, that the world's most powerful sentence exists, and if you lifted it out of context, you know, everyone would just worship it. Clearly, that's wrong.
Right, and I think what you were saying about the expression of the actor, and as you know, prose writers, we don't have that, but what we do have is metaphor and simile, and film does not have that. So a really beautiful conveyance of a character's expression is usually given to me in some other way. It's not the physical description of the eyebrow lifting and the mouth curling, right? It's that like that new layer of meaning that you can't convey without prose.
Yes, misery wrote itself over his face like a dried up waterfall. I mean, how do you do that in a movie?
Right. Yes. Yep. Yeah.
Can you just imagine the director literally translating it the other way around? Okay, what we need now is we need a barely running waterfall.
Yes, and we'll superimpose that image over his face. Oh, that would be so awkward. But
it is interesting where the media just completely do not cross over. And I think that's a great place to be as a writer, to understand what you can do, you know, in your text.
Yeah. So did you guys find any bad sentences? Or did you look for any? Right. Oh, let me get my manuscript.
Actually, funny you should say that. I was reading I finished it last night, a science fiction masterpiece, because I have some holes in my reading repertoire, I suppose. And this is a space opera that's extremely highly regarded, that I was lucky enough to have a couple of people compared my writing to.
Nice.
And so I thought, I'd better read this. And the story was good, but it was like reading a boy's own comic. It's peppered with with adverbs, with silly sentences, with cardboard characters, and so I was reading that thinking that I'm not going to bring a sentence from this. Yet it's a series that would regularly probably appear in the top 5 of all space opera.
Right.
So you know, it goes to again the fact that I suppose story trumps prose.
Right. Right, and I think too we can touch on genre there. If somebody is reading a literary novel, they're expecting the prose
Yes.
to have a certain lyrical quality. But if somebody is reading a page turner or a beach read,
Pulp Fiction.
they're doing this with the pages. They're flipping them quickly,
Yeah.
and they aren't trying to absorb sentences at that level of, beauty and
Right.
deep comprehension. They're really in it just for the plot, the romance, what they want out of it is very different. And so the genre expectations are different, put different requirements and restraints on us as writers. And I think that can be a bad thing or a good thing. It depends on how you want to look at it and what your goals are as a writer.
And also to some extent current culture versus older culture. So, the way we use exposition now is completely different to, Dickensian times. And so this series that, I'm reading is probably wartime or pre-Second World War, somewhere around there. So quite different in the way that things are discussed. So yeah, it's all very gung ho, men swinging into action and saving the world type stuff. And nowadays that would be hard to launch. So it might be a much loved series. Anyway, so yes, certainly found examples of sentences where I thought, well, I'm not giving up on this book, and I'm kind of enjoying it, but I have to say I wouldn't write it like this.
Right. Yeah.
That said, though, I think a lot of reasons why I will struggle to get into a book is because of sentence level issues,
Yes.
right? So like if I'm reading a story and like within the first couple chapters, the sentences are really stilted or the voice is really weird to me or they're saying things that just don't work and they're clunky, then I will just, it's just not worth my time, right? So I think that as much as it's like, okay, worry about the story, it's like those sentence level details can really throw me out of a story.
Yes.
Just like gone. So.
Same here. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the narrative voice as well. So it doesn't just mean a sentence is mechanically poor or the rhythm never changes if a voice is, like flat, halting, monotonous.
I pulled a book that I didn't get very far into, but that I had downloaded on my Kindle, and I knew it was there. It was like one of those ones that you I'm never going to finish this, but I had started. So I pulled that one out, and I was looking at it, realizing that the sentences had been copy edited. There were not comma mistakes. There were not, it wasn't like the sentence itself was a fragment or a run-on. There weren't any grammatical issues, right? It was just like the constant over explanation, telling, just the voice of the character being really inconsistent and all over the place. It was very hard for me to just get into what was going on because of the way that the sentences were explaining, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, which is a really good takeaway for everybody, that what makes a good sentence in narrative prose is not mechanical.
Right. You can have a subject and a verb and an object and everything can be in the right order, but if your subject is not, it's just, sorry. Pause. End segment.
All right. Should we look at a sentence?
Yes.
Yeah, let's do it.
Conceptually.
All right. Okay. As I said, I pulled, I think, 7 things. So no particular order. Jeanette Winterson, The Passion. And... oh. Okay. This is a fun one. So as we were kind of noting already, reading a single sentence alone won't really give enough context for the sentence to deliver what it needs to. So the sentence I picked out is the first one I'm going to read, but then I'll read a little bit more for that context. And there is a scene break right before this sentence. Gaiety soon ages. By 3 o'clock, the revelers were drifting away through the arches around St. Mark's or lying in piles by the cafes, opening early to provide strong coffee. So And Gaiety Soon Ages is its own paragraph as well. So there's a scene break, Gaiety Soon Ages,
Nice.
paragraph break.
Yeah.
And then we see, oh, I get it now. Yep, the party. Everyone got tired.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Nice. And then it's visually evocative as well, isn't it? So you've got the lying in piles thing where, as maybe as a first draft or a writer that hasn't learned expression yet, you'd be writing, people pulled chairs around and sat around, clearly tired from their social activities.
Right.
And so we've got lots of words, but lying in piles, just
yeah,
that's great.
Right.
Well, I like it. Gaiety Soon Ages sets like a philosophical tone to the whole scene. So you're viewing it from a very different place,
right?
Than if you just entered into like a bunch of people piled around everywhere. So
yeah, and it sets up intrigue. Like Gaiety Soon Ages, what does that mean? Oh, and it's apparent once you get the visual of these tired people drifting home or to the cafes. Yeah, but it's very strong in tone. That
three
kind of
words as well. That's very economic.
Right. And as its own paragraph.
And its own paragraph.
And opening up a scene. So it's a great example of a strong sentence, but it's so strong it functions all by itself. Right? It's aloneness sort of punctuates it. Like we are meant to absorb that. That paragraph break gives us space to kind of work with those 3 words before we read the next sentence.
Right.
Yeah, and in many ways as well, because the sentence itself is small and dwindles, it's metaphorically representative of what it's describing. So it's not a big, long sentence talking about, brightness and noise and sound. And, it's just very, we're done.
Right.
Yeah. Party's over. It's a good way of expressing that. I like it.
Right. And I like that it says soon ages. So soon, so it's quick, it's premature, but aging is this process that takes years or even decades to occur. So there's this kind of juxtaposition, right? Yeah, it's a great way to say the party was winding down. It's fresh and evocative.
Yep, good. You get top points for finding that one.
Oh,
there
thank
you
you.
go. Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. So we'll put Jeanette Winterson aside. All right. Chumpa Lahiri from the Unaccustomed Earth. There we go. All right. So the narrator is explaining to us that Suta's parents moved from India to England in the 60s, I think it was, and had trouble finding housing, being Indian immigrants there. So they tell Suta the story of being cast out of an apartment because the mother was pregnant until they found this man, Mr. Paul, their new landlord. So here's the sentence. To Suta, the story was like an episode out of a Greek myth or the Bible, rich with blessing and portent, marking her family as survivors in strange, intolerant seas.
Another one with a good ending.
Yeah, and that ends that paragraph. So there's no scene break. And the next sentence is 4 years later, they moved to Massachusetts, but it caps that narrative about their time in England. Right. And that it was difficult because of prejudice.
Right. It's interesting because a lot of the words in there lend a really heavy weight to what had gone on in there, right? Because it's a story out of mythology or the Bible.
Right.
And so that gives it like this weight to it, right? That it's that kind of important.
Right. Yeah, and it really stands out here because all of the sentences before that in this paragraph are straightforward and functional. Her parents told her that half the rentals in London in the 60s said whites only, and the combination of being Indian and pregnant limited her parents, etc. So they're just giving us information which is important to the story and to understanding these characters, but it's informative, those sentences. So the power comes in that final sentence where we get the weight of the Greek myth and the Bible, the blessing and the portent. Okay, so this is significant to her life, the way, the seer is in a Greek tragedy or something. And then it marks her family in a certain way, right? So now we can characterize her and her parents in one particular way because they had to go through this experience. Like we could choose to feel that way about all of the information we were given, but we probably wouldn't. We would probably just say, okay, right, check. They were in London. There was prejudice. They couldn't find an apartment. Right, got it. But Lahiri gives us that sentence, right?
Yeah.
Wow, there's the punch. So there's the metaphor, the beauty.
Using the real references to major symbols that are well understood by every reader.
Right.
So it bridges that. They're semantically packed words, mythology, Bible, as Kathryn's pointed out. So
important, yeah.
So it's like when you were talking about it, saying the sentences leading up to it or the descriptive part leading up to it is fairly straightforward, and it occurred to me it's almost like an approaching thunderstorm where you can see the dark clouds coming, but it's not until it hits and you've got the thunder and the lightning and the squall that you feel it. So it's as if the writing has used that to edge it in, and then suddenly smack delivering that symbolic imagery in that particular sentence. So that's a clever technique as well.
It is, and I think it's interesting to note that in the Winterson example, those sentences opened a scene, and they stood on their own. So we were given the metaphor of gaiety aging, right? And then we had the description of physical activity that explained that metaphor, that made it tangible for us. Yes. And in this one, we have the opposite, where there's a paragraph about a third of a page long that just explains to us what this family went through in very straightforward terms. And then it's all encapsulated in what that means to our protagonist, right?
Right.
So you sort of get the impact sentence placed at the top or at the bottom, but those are both powerful sentences, right? And then they both require some explanation or some unpacking, which we get adjacent to those sentences.
Yes, because without that, then you might have that purple prose, I suppose, where if you just stacked all these sort of, metaphorical or simile-based sentences together, after a while it would be wearing on the reader, and it could then develop as purple prose.
Right.
One of the things that we've used in writing marketing materials, and I've noticed that this works as well for fiction writing, it certainly works for non-fiction writing, is to look at beginnings and endings. And I don't know as an editor if you do that, but it's one of the things that we've done is you go through your own work and you bold the endings of every sentence, whether it might be one word or two words. So you can, and then you should, if it's well written, you should be able to see some kind of evolution just through tails of sentences. And it's a really interesting tool just to have another look at your work.
Right.
Because if we're always ending sentences limply or with a sort of run-on or with a tacked-on explanation, then you'll see that very, very rapidly. Whereas the ones you've just pulled out, you could do that. You go, wow, that's solid, that's solid, that's solid. It leaves you craving more. It's like that last mouthful of a gourmet dish.
Right. Yeah, very much. And I want to touch on what you were saying, Robert, about using too many metaphors and piling them on each other. One of the writers who I mentor, he writes some incredible metaphors and similes. I mean, like total metaphor envy here. I wish I could come up. They're so fresh and so exciting sometimes, but then he'll put too many in. You might get like 5 on a page and they lose their impact. They become diluted, right? So you want to have that really powerful bit of prose, be it a metaphor or imagery or that punching sentence. You want to give it room to breathe on the page so that when the reader gets to it, it really affects the reader. If there's too much of it too close together, then you kind of become desensitized to it. And it's a little bit like, check, yep, okay, got it. And you don't want that when you're crafting that beautiful, punching or imagery or metaphor or whatever that sentence is.
Right. Well, and it's worth noting, too, that sentence that you just read, there are technically 3 different metaphors within that sentence, right? But they all kind of work hand in hand, even though they're 3 very separate pictures. Because, like, it says what? Greek mythology and the Bible, blessing important, and then it talks about, is it turbulent seas?
Survivors in strange, intolerant seas.
Right. So, like, all of those things, like, kind of allude to each other. So, like, if I think Greek mythology and then I start thinking about, like, turbulent seas, it immediately draws these pictures of, like, the Odyssey and, all of those, like, journeys and quests that happened within the mythology, and, like, the Bible and blessings and portents and mythology. So even though they're 3 very separate images, they all complement each other. Yeah, exactly.
Whereas if you had said, it was full of Greek mythology and screaming sawmills.
Right.
That wouldn't work.
No. So it's, as you said, I think you not only is it the number, but it's also somehow how they interconnect too. So that beautiful writing comes when you see people that have smashed it. I mean, who would think I'm going to write something about Greek mythology and Bible in the same sentences? You don't. That's the kind of thing that comes out in flow, isn't it? You don't necessarily going to think, oh yeah, that's going to be a beautiful sentence there, I'm going to save that one up.
Right. Now I am going to disagree with you a little bit, Kathryn, in that I think it's only one simile in this
maybe
in this sentence, but
they use different ideas that all complement each other, right?
Well, like to Suta, the story was like an episode out of a Greek myth or the Bible, rich with blessing and portent, marking her family as survivors in strange, intolerant seas. Right.
Yeah,
so it's like that episode.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is full of blessings and portents and marks her family in this way. But yeah, now would you guys revise this sentence? Would you change anything about it?
That's hard to know without putting it in context. I think I mean, if you take it out of context, you could say, well, there's a lot going on in there. Is there, could the punch be strengthened by taking at least one of those clauses out? Possibly, but that's then putting my voice on top of that instead of the writer's voice. So the rhythm and the lilt of it is, to me, is fine.
Right.
And because the ending is so lovely, you kind of left with, like I said, like the taste of that last delicious morsel.
Right.
So I think you can forgive a sentence that's got lots of clauses if what it leads you to is, you come around the corner and then you see the palace type of thing.
Yeah. So you just said something interesting, Robert. You said you can forgive a sentence with a lot of clauses, which made me think about how sentences perform different functions in our writing. So if you're writing a very plot-driven scene, you're probably going to have shorter sentences that are about action, right? And they're moving the story forward in a very specific way. But then when, or if you're writing narrative exposition, like this paragraph where you're just explaining something to the reader, those sentences are going to be functional and straightforward. They might be long, they might have clauses, they might not. There's probably a variation therein, but they're simple, straightforward, easy to read. It's when you get to that moment where you pause the action or pause the narrative to make meaning of it, to deliver meaning. That's when you get these more sort of fluid, maybe even convoluted sentences that have the imagery or the metaphor or the extra clauses to do the compare and contrast type stuff.
It's almost like the more meaning you need to have, the more poetic your sentence is going to feel.
Yes. Yeah. Well said.
Cool.
and that might mean that it's still short, like gaiety soon ages.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
That's super poetic, that sentence.
Right. Come back next week for part 2 of this episode. We'll analyze some more great sentences and figure out how they function in our stories. It's not just about being poetic. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.